This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the hippies and the counterculture of the 1960s. I have Michael J. Kramer with me to speak about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Michael J. Kramer is my guest. As I usually like to do, I like to give my guests a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. So, Michael, welcome. If you could tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, and anything related to the hippies that has you here.
Well, I'm a historian, trained as particularly as a cultural and intellectual historian, and I wrote my first book about uh, the topic of music and the hippies and the counterculture in two places in the 1960s and into the early 1970s. In San Francisco, one of the kind of epicenters of countercultural life at the time, and then in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I was curious about this kind of trans-Pacific circulation of rock music and countercultural ideas back and forth between San Francisco, which actually was the primary city from which the US waged the war in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam, where, of course, Americans went as the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and Southeast Asia escalated. So I got curious about how rock music circulated and why it was so important to people at the time. And in a book called The Republic of Rock, Music and Citizenship in the 60s Counterculture, which came out about 10 years ago or so, I tried to use archival sources to better understand the kind of engagements with citizenship that music sparked and sustained in these two places, San Francisco and Vietnam, and then around the world from there. So I got really curious about why people were so into the music, why it was so important to them, and how they connected it to what it meant to be American, what it meant to feel like you might be the citizen of a thing called the counterculture, the kind of public life that the music generated in domestically in the U.S., and then what kind of civic culture did it actually create within a war zone in Vietnam. So that's kind of where my research began on this topic, and I've continued to work on a project now about the Berkeley Folk Music Festival, which took place on the Cal campus in Berkeley from the late 50s and through the 1960s. So that's kind of kept me, among some other projects I've done, kind of in this area of hippies and countercultural life.
So, one of my premises is when I was emailing around for doing a show like this was that the hippie movement, the counterculture of the 60s, has always sort of been blamed for all the ills from Reagan onward. And in reality, it was a reaction against the Eisenhower years. But it's interesting that you talk about your first being drawn by the music, because one of the things I did notice, and I was born in 1965, and so I grew up when I was 3 or 4 years old. I remember seeing the groovy hippie girls with their tied, and even then I was a horny little guy. But I found it interesting that the hippie counterculture was never particularly strongly tied to other movements of the era. It wasn't necessarily tied to the civil rights movement, to the equal rights movement, to gay rights. You didn't see many hippies, for example, marching with Martin Luther King, although it was maybe a little bit too early. You didn't see many hippies, standing on the steps with Bella Abzug for equal rights amendment, that sort of thing. Would it be fair, do you think, to say that the hippies and the counterculture had a narrow purview, a narrow slice of what they were focused on?
It's a great question. I think in a way, it depends what kind of counterculture and what kind of hippiness we're talking about. There's a certain way in which the cultural forms of getting looser. I mean, it's interesting. You remember, kind of your own awakening young sexuality as part of this, because the music and some of the hippie ideas, I think, reached into people's bodies in a different way than politics necessarily
Well,
did.
large unbrassiered breasts will do that to a young boy.
And some young women at the time too, probably. That's was a big, of course, sexuality and being less, being less Victorian about it and a little more open to it was a big part of the hippie and counterculture movement. But it speaks to your question, which is, in one sense, hippies and the counterculture were everywhere. Certainly, as the '60s moved into the '70s, it showed up in popular culture. People were curious about how to connect their own personal journeys or experiences, to use terms from the time, to larger political questions. And on the other hand, as you were suggesting, it was something more narrow in the sense that the counterculture didn't concern itself as overtly with like a particular political ideology, a particular political movement. So what drew me to it as a historian was this weird quality in which it was kind of everywhere and somewhat nowhere all at the same time. I think that's one of the important things about culture as compared to looking more at like a more organized political movement.
Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking as you were saying that, I was remembering the end of Mad Men where Don Draper supposedly is the guy who does the famous Coca-Cola commercial. And it seems to me how easily co-opted so much of hippiedom was by Wall Street, because these were basically middle class white kids from the suburbs. And so it's easier to present them their faces in selling things than it is, Negroes that are getting uppity, or gay homosexuals after Stonewall. They're easier to sort of assimilate, and we actually saw that with the not the yippies, the yuppies, and a lot of former hippies in the Reagan years, coming out of the closet, so to speak, as right wingers.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I mean, there were African American folks and others, let's say non-white folks, who were curious and interested in these movements, and internationally, of course, particularly I think after the Woodstock film and album, there was a real international interest in this, all in the let's say the decolonizing world. But it's true that from the beginning, and there's been some really interesting scholarship about this, like a book such as Tom Frank's The Conquest of Cool, which is a great title. He was interested in how the advertising and marketing industries, in other words, the world of Mad Men, were onto the fact that you could sell rebellion against Madison Avenue from Madison Avenue. So I
And this is
think
the same Tom Frank that did the Kansas book, or What's the Matter with Kansas?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, this was his dissertation and his first book. It's a wonderful study. I mean, he really looks at how the advertising firms, the actual Don
Yeah.
Drapers, in a sense, they helped to create the counterculture. They
Mm.
weren't just kind of co-opting it.
Mm.
Now, what I was curious about when I went and looked at other sources as a historian was what was so interesting in a place like San Francisco was that people knew this was happening. I mean, they weren't fools. They saw from the beginning, even in the early and mid '60s, that their movement was, if you want to call it a movement, that what they were interested in, kind of throwing off the constraints of the '50s, as you put it, that this was that this was as much kind of part of mass culture as something easily separate from it. So I was very curious at how it's within the counterculture that people are already starting to be aware of how easy co-optation could be with a movement that was cultural and involved buying things and selling things, and and there were various responses to that, to this kind of new, as some called it at the time, this new form of hip consumerism, hip capitalism, People knew that it was happening. So I think that's there was a kind of awareness within the counterculture that that I don't think it's been credited for entirely. Now the only other thing I was going to say in response to your excellent point was that the counterculture's ideology had a strong libertarian streak from the beginning. If you're going to throw off constraint from Eisenhower America, you're interested in freedom. And for many people, that was as much, that could lead in what we today think of as more right-wing directions as much as in left-wing directions. It wasn't clearly just a left-wing movement.
Yeah. Well, they also sort of flirted with anarchism. I mean, if you look at libertarian and anarchism, they're sort of kissing cousins, but there's a difference between being an actual civil libertarian and a corporate libertarian, as the Libertarian Party is now.
Yeah.
Let me just ask about music, and then I want to bring up 2 points. I was thinking, just as you were speaking again, that how many television shows of the late 60s, early 70s were reworked themes from hit songs just 2 or 3 years before, not to mention 10 times as many theme songs for products. The 1970s were rife with them. Wasn't it like Windex, let the sun shine, let the sun shine? I think that was a Windex commercial it became.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole hippie phenomenon from the beginning was always tied up with life in a mass consumer society, and some people dreamed that you could just kind of so drop out, as Timothy Leary famously put it in his tune in, turn on, drop out ideas. And some people tried to do that, but most people weren't ready to go that far. And so in this sense we might have to say there were, again, we might say there were many kind of countercultures, many kind of hippies of different sorts that even to this day we're still trying to sort out, kind of these different levels of politicization, these different levels of, as you say, like people who tilted in, whether they knew it or not, in a more anarchist direction or in a more libertarian direction or in a more communitarian direction, or, so there was, I think what's interesting about the hippies and the counterculture is precisely this kind of amorphousness of it. So it went everywhere, it even within, I mean, what I discovered in Vietnam was that there was a kind of, the military faced a problem. They had plummeting morale among these young troops that they had drafted in a war that was, no one understood why they were fighting it exactly. What did the army do? What did the military do? The armed forces do? They did what they always do. They tried to import a taste of home to the troops to keep them, to get morale up. So they organized soldier rock bands playing acid rock at like fire bases in Vietnam, and
which was the genesis for Coppola's famous Playboy bunnies in
exactly.
Now.
The more I studied the archive, the more I thought that Apocalypse Now, although we always thought of it as kind of a kind of feverish fantasy, actually wasn't that far from the reality, which was sort of terrifying. But if there was a hip capitalism going on the home front that people were either doing or trying to make sense of, what I thought I saw in Vietnam was kind of hip militarism developing. And in the way you're talking about, of the ability of corporate America, of the armed forces, of the state to kind of take these forms of cultural freedom and try to deploy them for their own purposes.
Sticking with music, let's talk about sort of the forebears of the hippies, and that would be the beatniks, and their connection with jazz and black musicians, the poets like Allen Ginsberg and a handful of others. It seems to me that I had mentioned how white suburban kids were were more accessible for Wall Street to sort of tap into. A lot of the beatniks, were that way too. But it seemed that the hippies were sort of beatniks 2.0. There was something more accessible for the older generation, for the people in power. Maybe it was easier to poo-poo them since they were just about horny kids in the majoritarian view, horny kids just looking to screw around. Talk to me about where the beatniks came from and how did they morph into the hippies? Because it seems like the hippies sort of wiped the beatniks off the countercultural scene.
It's such an interesting kind of, it's like a question almost of microgenerations a bit, I think. So many of the people, there's a great quote that in Alice Eccles' study of the Haight-Ashbury from a guy who became a photographer. I think his name was Bob Feidemann. I'm forgetting his last name. Wonderful photographer. And he said, first of all, he pointed out that the people that shaped something like the Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco they all started out as beatniks. They were a little too old to be beats. Yeah. They weren't Allen Ginsberg's age, but they were older than what he called the bubblegum, or I don't know if he actually calls them this, but the more bubblegum hippies in the late 60s. People coming of age with JFK, people coming of age between 60 and 65 were people who they were impressed by Ginsberg and Kerouac and Gary Snyder and the Beats, and maybe the painters, the abstract expressionists. And of course, everyone was really impressed by the jazz guys and the kind of pursuit of art and freedom that they were involved in. But they were kind of coming of age with JFK. But this is before you had the full kind of commercial circulation of as you witnessed, from when you were born, of kind of the hippie on television. Yeah. So he said to Alice Eccles, he said, a hippie was someone who borrowed your truck and didn't return it. We were freaks, he said. We called ourselves freaks. So I think there's this kind of interesting microgenerations, like people born during World War II, war babies who came of age a little bit after the Beats, but before the full kind of bubblegum Woodstock hippies. They were, maybe involved in the folk revival. They were interested in JFK. They were maybe pulled into the civil rights movement a bit. And they're the ones who really kind of shaped these worlds, these little pockets of rebellious culture. And they thought of themselves as freaks. Of course, when they all got wind of LSD, that was a big, kind of supercharged force. So they were listening to music and began to make music. To me, they were interested in this kind of amalgamation of African-American vernacular forms of music, jazz, blues, and how could they relate to that music from their own place of where they were coming from. So I think you get rock music in a way out of this primarily this white engagement with these different black forms of music, through the folk revival, through jazz, through rock and roll, of course. People trying to say, like, how can I authentically play this music? And that's, I think, what gave rise to the kind of the rock music scene in a place like San Francisco or Liverpool or in Vietnam a little bit later.
Well, I was just it's interesting you mentioned Liverpool, because I was going to say that was hippiedom mostly just the American response to the 1960s? Because you had swinging London in 65, 66. You had the mods, as they called them, there. I know there were versions of the mods and the hippies throughout Europe, here and there, little pockets. But it seems to me that what we think of now, with more than half a century of looking back, the hippies were pretty much an American phenomenon. Or am I wrong there?
I would say it was an international phenomenon. Certainly there was a kind of a transatlantic exchange between that first generation of rock and rollers in the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, and so on, and what people in a place like Liverpool were hearing. But I mean, maybe one way to think about it is what kind of cultures can develop within American empire during the Cold War?
Mm-hmm.
Because the U.S. is spreading its influence all around the world. That's why people are hearing this music. And then what do they do with that? What do they do with this kind of music of freedom, so to speak? I mean, you even have hippie in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
You have young people who...
Yevgeny Yevtushenko was probably the most well-known Russian.
Exactly. Or think of someone like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, who's listening to the Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa. So, so I think it was an international phenomenon, but an international phenomenon shaped by, I mean, what do we want to call it? American cultural and military imperialism and power around the world.
So we did then get in the late 60s, we got a lot of these festivals, and obviously Woodstock, the Monterey Pop Festival, and probably in Europe, the Isle of Wight Festival might be the most best known there. It does seem that musically, though, even though we talk about the British invasion, a lot of the British musicians, especially mod bands, the most obvious one being the Who sticks in my mind. The hippies, they hippified themselves, and that gave us Tommy, and then later Quadrophenia.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely becomes these exchanges, let's say across the Atlantic, for example, of the Who maybe shaped a little more by the more clear class politics of Britain compared to the U.S., where class is so much more amorphous at that time. You have this huge middle class in the 60s, and then you get, of course, I mean, who look at the San Francisco bands, for example, that become famous: the Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead. They're all folkies who hear the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
Well, and even like the Great Society, which bequeathed what's her name to the Jefferson Airplane, Grace Slick.
Grace Slick.
Yeah. They were there in 64, 65, and they, I think, actually emerged. Some of them were beatniks before they were hippies.
Oh yeah. They were beatniks. They were folk musicians. They were, and then they all hear that they all go to see Hard Day's Night, the film, and it just looks like a lot of fun. Yeah. I mean, who fun was the key word. I mean, in a way, sometimes what I've said is a good way to think about hippies and the counterculture might be around the concept of serious fun, in all senses of the term.
Yeah.
People wanted, as people would say at the time, like, that was serious fun. Like, that was really fun. But of course, serious fun also means that the fun has a kind of there's like a purpose to the fun, a social purpose to it. But I think this idea of, like, what kind of movement would put fun at the center of its ideological program? Where can you get if fun is your goal, and what are the limitations of making fun your goal? I mean, this might be one way to think about the hippies and the counterculture and their legacy.
Well, that brought to mind, I was raised as a Missouri Synod Lutheran. I remember getting into many arguments as a 5 or 6 year old with my pastor, Martin Stagey, and at the same time, you were having Jesus Christ Superstar, Hair, all of these things, and hippies were openly advocating Jesus as the rebel, the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus was the first hippie kind of thing, fun Jesus.
Yeah.
I can you speak a little bit to maybe how Jesus became a hippie?
It's a great question. I mean, maybe a way to think about that is to think about the spiritual dimensions, or the yearning people had to find meaning in their lives, in a situation in which, well, I mean, you have the legacies of World War II, the traumas of World War II, you have the problems of a country in the United States reckoning with its shortcomings around questions of race and gender and sexuality, You have the Vietnam War, of course, is horrifying most people. So there's a real yearning for kind of like spiritual understanding of self and of world, but again, like set to this idea of needing to have fun, ecstatic fun, revelatory, fun, that pleasure. It's the politics of pleasure that's at the center of this new kind of vision in popular culture of a figure like Jesus, I think.
So let's turn to a little bit more sort of, I guess, meteor matters, meteor, not media. And I want to talk about two particular things that occurred during the hippie movement and are sort of tangentially related. The first is the Students for Democracy, SDS, and the second is the Chicago 7 trial after the Democratic Convention. Now, we just had a convention this year, just a few days ago, in Chicago, and it went a lot better, I guess, than the '68 convention. But let's talk about SDS, because this is probably, I guess it was a lot of the people involved in SDS who became what we talked about, the yuppies earlier. What was SDS, and what was the relationship for them to the hippie counterculture?
So SDS in particular emerges out of some of the youth groups of the socialists in America, who had, in many ways become quite marginalized by the Red Scare in the 1950s. And some of these students who were interested in politics gathered together in Port Huron, Michigan in 1962. Here we have figures like Tom Hayden, Todd Gitlin, Al Haber. Many of them were university students or graduate students. In 1962, they gather and they write this Port Huron Statement document, which is kind of the clarion call of the new left, as it became known, in contrast to the old left of the 1930s. And in the Port Huron Statement, which I teach to my students still, and they're always kind of interested in it, they're talking about two main issues that are facing young people in America in 1962. One is the question of racism and civil rights, and the other is the threat of nuclear annihilation. And in response to these kind of existential threats, they call for a politics of participatory democracy. And they're really serious. They're not really hippies. They're really kind of like people that would have been in the political clubs of your college campus.
Were they more? Would you say that they were more populist in the sense of, like, William Jennings Bryan, but for the 1960s, maybe?
Yes. They're really influenced by C. Wright Mills. Some of these other thinkers who wanted to develop a kind of American version of social democracy rather than look to the European Marxist Leninist models. So this is so it is populism in the broadest sense, but it's also the story of young people. I mean, there's already a kind of cultural component to it, because not only do they want to create a politics of participatory democracy, but they're already yearning for like a more cultural sense of authenticity. And as more young people in this kind of booming world of the expansion of higher education in the 60s, as more young people join SDS chapters in the mid-60s, you begin to see this kind of convergence of, let's call them beatniks, as you were doing before, and political people. And they're seeing common ground in the need to develop a culture of participatory democracy in which people feel like they have more control over their lives, they can be more free, and they can find ways to connect their own happiness to this, creating a better society. And of course, not only is the civil rights movement both succeeding and hitting up against some limitations by the mid-1960s, but also the Vietnam War is escalating. Mm-hmm. So you have young people kind of yearning for this more vibrant participatory democracy version of politics and culture, yearning for more authenticity in their lives and in their society, and also seeing that the mainstream apparatus of the society seems to be going to some extent in the opposite direction with the war and, kind of passing important legislation for civil rights, but people see there's still a lot of problems with racial, class, inequality, and of course soon growing awareness of issues for women, issues for gay Americans, issues for other ethnic groups. So I think SDS and participatory democracy is in many ways, comes out of the JFK optimism, sees that culture and politics are connected, wants to try to do something in the world, and then runs up against some of the challenges of trying to change political systems in post-war America and change the culture of the country.
I mentioned earlier about how Reaganism is often seen as hippies selling out, but a lot of people, I think, and I admired a lot of the people who were hippies. I think they were people who were mostly on principle, very principled. But there were a lot of critics, and it wasn't just right-wing critics. I was speaking this past weekend. I was doing an interview about a documentary film made of a friend of mine who died, with a fellow, a young, actually a trans activist who's a Marxist, and they were talking about Huey Newton, and I know that a lot of the Black Panthers sort of looked quite askance at the counterculture because they were white suburban kids that a lot of the Black Panthers didn't think could really identify with them. Am I misguided there? Because it's been years since I've read that, but I
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, of course, Huey Newton got obsessed with Bob Dylan, so it's complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think as African Americans got frustrated with the important but limited successes of the civil rights movement. I mean, to call them limited is a little unfair. I mean, the really crucial successes, but the continuation of racism and the problems of racism. Many people who are African American felt frustrated with this. There's a turn towards Black nationalism, towards Black power, towards separatism, a separate path away from an integrationist movement. And of course, the hippie and counterculture movement is interested in getting everybody together. I mean, that's what the festivals are about. That's what the neighborhoods are about. It's like, let's open it up so people can mix with each other. And it's not organized. And the Black Panthers, for example, see that if they're going to survive, they have to get really organized because they're going to face police brutality. They're going to face governmental surveillance. They're going to face all kinds of oppressions. And the counterculture didn't have good ways of responding to oppression. I mean, it was about being open.
Yeah.
So that was a real problem. The last thing I would just say about all that is that Reagan is fascinating because, of course, as governor of California, Reagan kind of builds his political career as the foil to the hippies. He's the one saying, how can they be having these crazy dances on the Cal campus? This is, there's naked people gyrating on the screen and it's obscene. And, he builds a cultural conservatism, a reactionary cultural conservatism as being against the hippies. Mm-hmm. But by 1980, when he's running for president, he's actually, I think that, the feeling of malaise, as, Jimmy Carter famously put it in the 70s, Reagan's kind of sunny optimism suddenly kind of appeals to hippies, and as some of them are, I mean, not to all of them, but to some of them as they're aging, as they're seeing, kind of how do we keep having fun, which always I think was at the core of hippies and the counterculture.
Now, you had mentioned police brutality, which segues right into the Chicago Seven. This is probably, one of. I mean, we can. I think it's fair to call it a political trial in its essence. For those who don't know, the 1968 Democratic National Convention was a shit show, basically. And it basically, in many ways, people would say retrospectively, it doomed the Democrats' chances against Nixon. But who were the Chicago Seven? And oftentimes they, and some even more extreme, like the Manson family, because of Charles Manson's musical aspirations, are often lumped together. Do you see a divide between the hippie counterculture in general and specific things like the Chicago Seven or the Manson family?
I mean, the Chicago Seven, I would say, were groups of political activists from the New Left as it was getting more and more militant. Some of the Black Power activists who want to use the 68 convention to escalate this kind of media politics of spectacle. And so, they're organizing protests in 68 in the streets to try to, as they put it, get the whole world watching. They were chanting, "The whole world is watching." So it's a turn among these political activists to a different mode of political activism, which is less about the slow work of door-to-door organizing, of working within the party system, the kind of reformist politics of the early New Left or the early civil rights movement. And it's a turn towards a kind of spectacular media politics of trying to cause confrontation and spectacle, and to bring out the reactionary forces of even liberal America, as well as just plain old reactionary America. I would say that's quite different from the Manson family. I think the Manson family, the people who were most horrified first by the Manson family were people who were already involved in the hippie and counterculture movement. You think about the reporting in Rolling Stone about it, and these other kind of venues of the counterculture, media venues of the counterculture, because what they see is the problem of this movement. Yeah. Its radical commitment to openness allowed creeps. Yeah. To do horrible things. And that happened in the Haight-Ashbury, where Manson was floating around for a while, far before, his own craziness. And it's so I think there's a difference here of the problem the counterculture and hippies faced of embracing this radical openness. How do you protect against people who are violent, who are abusive, who are manipulative, in ways that are as extreme as Manson or less extreme than that?
Yeah, and we're seeing echoes of it today with people like Trump and the MAGA. They have free speech. Well, yes, you should be free to have speech other than yelling fire in a crowded theater. But to call people names, to use the N word, to use all of these slurs over and over again, and then say, well, it's your problem to deal with it. You're seeing echoes of that to a lesser degree. But again, it goes back to the hippie, the openness. If you're an open society, how open are you, and do you have to have parameters with, if, for example, a lot of people will talk about the media today and they're both sidesism kind of thing, even if there is one side that is right or not, and often third and fourth and fifth sides are ignored.
Yeah, I think you could say there's a line here that's about I was going to say too, like, the kind of Trumpism and the MAGA movement. In a way, they embraced the politics of the Chicago Seven. It's a media politics. It's a shock politics. It's it's like the Chicago Seven channeled through Rush Limbaugh or something, and brought into the political, the political sphere from the right. I think, let's just put it this way. Of course, what happened with Charles Manson was horrifying to everyone, but for every example like that, I think we should always remember how many people in the counterculture kept their principles and kept, there were many acts of kindness, of generosity, of people accepting other people for who they were and finding a place for them, for accepting difference, for being committed to equality, think about the connections of the counterculture and the hippie movement. Yes, it had a strong sexist side, it had a homophobic side, but for every example of that, there were also a lot of young women and people who were figuring out their sexuality who found avenues to it through the counterculture. So, the shocking nature of Manson is a problem that the counterculture and those who might want to carry on the counterculture's legacy face. But on the other hand, we should always remember these other sides of the story, the people. I think for every Charles Manson, there were 5 or 10 people who, had their heads on straight about how to try to make a more decent world. It's easy to forget them because that doesn't, shock as much.
Yeah, and I want to I want to talk a little bit later about how the '60s bled into the '70s and Nixon's approach to hippiedom. But I do want to take a side step here because you did mention Haight-Ashbury, and it's interesting because the Summer of Love. This all ushers forth from San Francisco. Before the hippies, before the beatnik, San Francisco is basically Jack London's town. It was a town of manly men sailing across the Pacific, going up to the Yukon, doing this stuff. And then 50 or so years after London's heyday, we get the beatniks, and then that morphs into the hippies. So it's interesting. Do you see... What was it about San Francisco, let's say, that birthed the hippies from the Jack London macho man of adventure to hippiedom?
Well, of course, it was the Barbary Coast, as it were. It was a city, as a port city, it had always had a tradition. It had a little bit of this kind of libertarian tradition. It was more open to different ways of living. It had the macho stuff, but even prior to the rise of San Francisco as a capital of gay American culture, it was a place that tolerated a lot more different ways of being in the world.
Well, the first Barbary Coast in Africa was well known for pirates, and we know about pirates, right. So
yeah, exactly. So it's hooked into those legacies of even the gold rush, for example, creates this. You have all these people showing up, they have to kind of figure out how they're going to live with each other. So it has those traditions. I think what's crucial in the post-war period is that the Bay Area is part of the way that California itself is at the forefront of this new jet age post-war economic culture that comes out of the military buildup of World War II. So in a way, I think San Francisco is important because there's a lot of, it's a boom town in a way. There's a lot of abundance, and the abundance allows people the space to experiment a little more. There's a sense of you can get a job here or there and kind of get by pretty easily. There's government jobs. There's the rising Silicon Valley sector. There's the it's one of the centers of the military-industrial complex. In a way, hippies and the counterculture come out of the military-industrial complex, as strange as that sounds. It's out of the abundance of the Eisenhower years, you could say, that people are able to experiment a little bit more. So that's one thing. And then I think there was a moment where there was cheap housing, easy to get around, pleasant weather, universities around SF State and Cal, of course, and Berkeley and a few other places that you have a lot of students, a lot of people kind of curious about different ways of living. And finally, there's a kind of course, it had been a center of beat culture too. It was one of the nodes of Ginsberg and Kerouac and that whole crew in the 40s and 50s. But the other thing I think is that there is an awareness in San Francisco of what's happening back east and what's happening in Los Angeles. And there's a kind of, on the one hand, there's all this local stuff happening, but there's an awareness of these other places and wanting to do something different in relationship to these other places. So those are some of the factors why I think San Francisco became one of the key centers for this new cultural phenomenon, countercultural phenomenon.
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about sort of the influence of the counterculture on language. It was very powerful when I was young, groovy, hip, where the hippies come from. Be-ins spawned Laugh-In, which was the #1 show for 2 or 3 years in television. And they were groovy and all of these terms, but they didn't seem to last that long. If you went up to, if I was single and young and I went to a pretty 30-year-old woman and said, "You're one groovy chick," she wouldn't know what I was talking about. And I'm just wondering, what do you think? Was hippiedom doomed to being an ephemeral movement in a sense? Because language often is a telltale sign of how much impact a social or religious or political movement has. And it seems like within 15, 20 years, 1985 was a century away from 1965.
Yes, it's nice. Your sensitivity to language is kind of a signal about a historical phenomenon is really interesting. I mean, I would say there's, again, different levels, right? There's this bubblegummy level of language, clothing, styles of being that that wears out real quick. It's more like a fad. But on the other hand, think about the influence of these ideas of finding yourself, authenticity, self-help, spiritualism that is less connected to religious institutions, people, the whole New Age movement. Even young people today who, my students don't know. I mean, the 1960s might as well have been the 1860s for my students. For them, it's ancient. But the vestiges aren't in using the words like groovy and hip. The vestige is in this idea that you're supposed to live an authentic life, that you're supposed to find yourself, that you're supposed to be free. Their expectations about the good life, their expectations about who they should be and who others should be. I mean, these were profoundly shaped, I think, by the counterculture movement. So again, like some of it, the surface level faded away into cliche and hackneyed kind of stuff, but it seeped like tie-dye into deeper levels of American culture.
It's interesting. I often, when I interview professors, a lot of them fall into sort of the cliche when they start talking about jazz. They love jazz music. Or the other thing is Eastern philosophy and or religion. And when we talk about something like a be-in, it brings to mind the idea of being versus becoming. And a lot of people in the counterculture were like, you should just be, you don't have to become or whatnot. But number one, that clashes with sort of the American idea of the capital. You must constantly consume or whatnot. But in a more deeper sense, just being is kind of a dead end in terms of living. If you're becoming, like as someone who's an artist, you always want to become. You don't ever want to be satisfied. You want to to write a great novel, and then you want to write a better novel. You want to paint the Mona Lisa, and then you want to do Rembrandt, and go through the phases and whatnot. And it seems to me that part of this goes to sort of the East-West divide in religion and philosophy. If you can, for a moment, speak a little bit about the pros and cons of the Eastern influence. We all know about the Beatles and Maharishi and all that. If you could speak a little bit on that.
Great question. I mean, I think from what I saw as a historian, this might be the point of like a hippie was someone who borrows your truck and doesn't give it back. We were freaks. Mm-hmm. I mean, the early kind of shapers of what would become hippiedom and the counterculture wanted to do stuff. The idea wasn't to like go, especially on the West Coast, the idea wasn't to, for example, the idea was not to take LSD in some spiritual retreat. The idea was to take LSD and go out in the world. Mm. The idea was to engage with the world, to be more alive. So I think that the early years of the counterculture were shaped a little more by this idea, this more, I guess you could say, a more Western idea of kind of doing things. I mean, I'm always a little hesitant. Those are such huge categories of East and West. But it is true that there was also an interest in becoming more aware of and more compassionate of the natural world, to decenter humans, the emergence of a kind of ecological vision of the world. Maybe someone on the West Coast like Gary Snyder is a beat kind of writer. I mean, he actually says he's not a beat writer, but he's part of this movement of kind of an Americanization of Zen. And there's a lot of people who get interested in that. Like, how do we stop being so egocentric so that we can lead a more principled life, so that we can be more ethical, so that we can try to make a better world. And of course, on top of that are plenty of people that are, as you were sort of suggesting before, they're just using some of the cliches of all of this, either to try to pick up a partner or to, try to seem cool. I mean, you have these different layers. There's deeper layers and there's more superficial layers, and they're all bending around each other within these milieus, I think.
So as I jump back in, I want to just do another little sidestep to a topic that I've never heard addressed in discussions of the counterculture of the 60s. Certainly talk about open sex and sexuality, but I want to talk about the counterculture's influence on pornography. The reason I do so is when I was about 5 years old, I grew up in a very Goodfellas type neighborhood, so there was all these things going on, and there were often abandoned warehouses where porno films were being shot. When I was 5 years old, I actually saw a porno film being shot because the mob guys who were financing it would send little kids like me out to go to the local deli to get food for all the bushy-haired people. And anyway, one of the directors was a fairly well-known director in Hollywood. His name was Buzz Kulik. If you ever saw Brian's Song, a television film about a dying American football player, he did that. But he also did porno on the side when apparently, he's dead now, so I can say it, he apparently had a big drug habit, and in order to make extra money, he did this. Now, I've wondered how we went from blue films, because he started out doing blue films, what were called blue films, but by the mid-60s, when the hippies took over, we got the Bushes, we got the open sexuality, and we got full-out pornography. We then got was it 68? We got the X rating and the movie rating system. So maybe you don't have an opinion about it, but I've never heard anyone else opine. Do you think there's any causal relationship between the openness of sexuality with hair and the nudity on stages and pornography? Because to me, that seems to have been when it flowered.
I mean, it's there's other probably historians that could answer this with even more knowledge than me, but my sense is that, of course, there was always pornography of various sorts, as we know, all the time. But there's a wonderful study of 1970s kind of middle class culture by the sociologist Sam Binkley, and he talks about this urge among middle class Americans to get looser. This is being shaped somewhat by the marketing of a kind of, this kind of hippie culture, and it's being shaped by people's feeling that the mainstream institutions weren't well, look, I mean, the war undid the legitimacy, and then of course Nixon's Watergate. I mean, these things all start to undo the legitimacy of those in power. So you lose a sense of order. You have a counterculture that's interested in exploration, openness, freedom, and it's a great place if you're a mafioso, or if you're interested in exploiting people. It's like a market. Mm-hmm. So I think I guess the other part of your question is also about the way that some of these more challenging forms of frank sexuality move into the mainstream as well. So you've got all this new kind of, what do we want to call it? This the X-rated culture, the porno industry, but you also have the influence of avant-garde theater, which has gotten interested in bringing more frank presentations, of more confrontational presentations of the human body onto the stage, like the like Judith Malina and the theaters in New York and so on and so forth. And Hollywood is getting interested in that in this. So there's a more confrontational kind of atmosphere that I suppose emerges around being more honest and frank and unrestrained about sexuality, and in all its positive dimensions. And I think also people get curious and want to explore the unruly, the anarchic in the negative sense of the term, what are we as humans exactly, and what are the darknesses as well as the light.
Yeah, my final say on the pornography is Buzz Kulik directed David Jansen of The Fugitive in a Western, and I thought it was the coolest thing. I thought it was cooler to see that David Jansen had signed a photo of him and Kulik together. At 5 or 6, while I liked the big breasted teenage girls on my block, I wasn't as I was like, boy, what's that bushy stuff there? But
yeah.
to move on, let's talk about we mentioned the Manson family, and oftentimes, certainly in rock history, Kent State is often seen as the death of the counterculture, the beginning of the end. Ohio, the song by Neil Young, documenting that. Is there any real? It's nice to wrap things in a neat, tidy bow, but did the hippies just sort of fade away rather than have a definitive end?
You could also think of like the way Altamont was represented. Yeah. The sort of Woodstock gone wrong.
Yeah.
Of course, I think in the contemporary culture at the time, there was an interest in this kind of rise and fall story. Innocence, and now there's a historian who wrote wonderfully about this. I'm forgetting his name right now, but there's a kind of Garden of Eden narrative that emerges, like everything's innocent, and then there's the fall from grace. Yeah. With this. I mean, in some ways that's true, but in another sense, you could say that the heyday of hippiedom is in the 70s. If you want to think about when more Americans got more interested, more broadly speaking, not just in middle class culture, but even in a lot of areas of working
Well,
class culture in
maybe
hippie
through
life.
the mid 70s, because musically, since we started out on that tangent, didn't disco come in and wipe that out? Wasn't disco almost like an early echo of the coming Reaganism in a sense? Just let's dance and let's not have any responsibility
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Well, I mean, disco is complicated
Yeah.
because on the one hand, the commercialization of disco seems to be about a sort of a rejection of the natural. There's an interest in the synthetic, the artificial. But of course, disco started among mostly working class queer people of color.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
it's
right out of the gay rights movement. Yeah, obviously,
exactly.
you just see the way they dress with the feather boas and the platform shoes.
Yeah, and it was for in the early days of disco. I think it was a kind of for people who were finding themselves in a way. It was an extension of the hippie counterculture. And people were kind of, if you were a young queer Latino man in New York City, you found your people. And it was ecstatic, and it was like your Woodstock.
Yeah.
Later, of course, as we've been saying, there's always this entanglement between those moments of these kind of subcultural spaces, and they're entangled with the Don Drapers, the Coca-Colaization of the counterculture, the Pepsiization, I guess we should say, of the counterculture. So there's always, it's not pure. I think that's important about the counterculture and hippies. What's interesting about it historically is that it's totally flawed. It's a total failure. There's lots of bad art made. There's lots of creeps. There's lots of problems. It's so open. It leaves the door open for murder and violence and corruption. It's got all kinds of problems. But then again, the larger world had lots of problems too. I mean, the Vietnam War was a problem.
Yeah.
It wasn't like Reagan, of course, is offering a kind of fake solutions, but as governor of California, and certainly later when he runs for president. So I think of it as this big, messy movement that, you could even think of disco, you could think of punk rock, which, punk rock thinks of itself as a reaction against the hippies, but in some ways it's a reaction because they want the hippies to live up to what they believed in, and they see it as a failure, that it hasn't, so there's a kind of, I think there's a story here of continuity as well, a story in which these ideas of the counterculture are like floating through the mainstream. They're easily corrupted and flawed, but lots of people are able to use them to try to make their own lives and those around them better, not because they offer some pure answer, but precisely because these countercultural ideas are like so intertwined in all of the flawed problems of the world. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of my take on it.
Now, I'm probably going to hopefully have a show with another fellow who we tried to get on this show, but we have having some technical difficulties. And I know he is mostly focused on nature and ecology, and that's a big part of the counterculture. But I'd just like to ask you at least briefly, since your expertise is in a little bit other area. What is your thoughts about the beginning of Earth Day and recycling and all these things that came in that era? And just like with the moon landing, though, it seems to have just fizzled out. Wherefore ecology in all of this?
In some ways it's gone deeper. We have recycling, we have, an effort to move towards solar power and wind power. We have people have a kind of a little more consciousness in some areas about trying to have a more balanced presence on the earth with the sustaining the world. It also generated an enormous reaction. I think you could see, everything. It's easily co-opted with like greenwashing and these, this stuff. But of course, it's been fiercely opposed. I mean, even the idea of something like climate change being, kind of questioned as science is, at once the kind of the questioning of the counterculture you can see there, but also there's a reaction against these efforts. So I would say, again, like the hope at the original Earth Day was like, we're going to change the world immediately. We're going to turn the world in a whole different direction. That was the dream of 68. That's the dream of the Haight-Ashbury Summer of Love. That's the dream of so many of these moments is like, let's say the kind of broadly speaking, the baby boom generation sort of saying, we're going to shift the world now. And I think what we're seeing is that that's not how change works. I mean, most of the time you can't just shift the world in one event. It gets murky and messy, and it's a slower process of change and continuity and adaptation and reaction. These are the kind of ways in which I think about the counterculture historically. It's like with the ecological movement, it pushed it forward a bit. It generated a reaction. It suffused the mainstream culture in some ways, but in ways that circulated broadly. But because they could circulate broadly, they had less of a kind of precise effect on changing the world.
I want to get back to the music here, and one of the things as sort of we transitioned musically from the height of the hippie music and hippie counterculture into, we mentioned disco and you mentioned punk rock, but there was a thing that was big in the early '70s called soft rock, and a lot of these purveyors were male, and they were sort of looked down as wimpy, effeminate, what would now be called beta males. We're talking the James Taylors and the John Denvers and Bread, groups like Bread or America, that would talk in their songs about this, that, or the other thing, but oftentimes it seemed sort of like refried counterculture stuff. Oh, I'm going to get high on the sunshine. America's horse with no name, the lostness of existence. Bread, basically just a man sort of doing what would later be called sort of the Alan Alda, Phil Donahue. Let's supplicate to our lover rather than being a macho man. What is your thoughts about soft rock? Does it have any bearing on the hippie, the outflow of hippiedom?
Well, I think maybe the best way to think about that would be to connect it to women's liberation, second wave feminism, and the way that second wave feminism is not just becomes in some sense not just a movement for women's equal rights, but a movement that wants to adjust the range of masculinity in American culture. So, the examples you're giving here, I mean, let's always remember that this is the sort of the commercial music industry trying to figure out what's going to stick. And, there's all along with counterculture music. I mean, there's plenty of there's all kinds of different quality of music being made. But I would say, if anything, if you want to read that kind of music historically, it's this moment when there's a rethinking of American masculinity sort of going on. Mm-hmm. And again, think about the shadow of the Vietnam War. I mean, think about where there's a questioning of hypermasculinity in a way, and thinking about the problems it's created. And some of that's coming out of the women's movement, which is, really forcing people to think more critically about these questions. And maybe the music kind of registers this, for some men, it was, of course, for some men, this was a liberation. You didn't have to be the macho guy. You could be a fuller human being. So I think, you know, whether you like some of that music or don't, some people love it, some people it's nostalgic, some people, they can't stand it and they want to go right away to punk rock or disco or whatever other genre that had a little more like energy and harshness to it. Okay, fine, but in that, maybe if you think about that music historically, you might see it as part of this moment when there's an effort to broaden what it could mean to be masculine.
So I want to close with asking about the legacy of the hippies. But before I do that, let me just ask you if there's any points that I may have missed or something that you wanted to just add in that isn't in the usual discussion of the counterculture.
Well, no, you've asked great questions. I mean, I think what I was struck by in my research on the counterculture was um, the richness of asking questions that I saw. And there's a great poster from the acid tests that took place in San Francisco. So sort of Ken Kesey's and the early Grateful Dead kind of concerts where they weren't even concerts. I mean, what they were was kind of a get together where people experimented with LSD and electronic equipment, and again, the sort of coming together. What does it mean to come together in the modern world and try to live differently together and experiment together? One of the posters is just a big poster of question marks. And I always think of that poster as being at the heart of what the counterculture and hippiedom was about, which was a lot of people asking questions about themselves and their world. How could we be different if we don't feel like the world is how we want it to be? What does it mean to really be free? What does it mean to live in a really highly technologically mediated society and still feel a sense of authenticity? It's not that they didn't have a program really other than this program of asking questions. So I always thought of my book in a way, the Republic of Rock book. I mean, I always called it an intellectual history of how hippies danced, in the sense that what's easy to miss in all of this is just the I don't know, the robustness of everyday people asking questions about their lives and their society. And I think that can easily get lost in the horrible things that happened and in the the frustration of not having answers, but asking a lot of questions of themselves and each other. And of those in power and also asking questions of those who wanted to have power.
When you mentioned the Grateful Dead, I immediately thought of a word that again didn't have staying power, the word burnout. When I was growing up, the Deadheads were always considered the burnouts.
Right.
So I opened by asking, or by making the claim that I thought that looking back with 50 years of hindsight, that most of the hippies that I knew were right on major things. And if I look at a lot of the things that are just given half-hearted attempts of relevance by the political powers in this country, things like universal basic income, things like Medicare for all, or student loan repayment, the ecology, and things like this. It has now, in the last decade, let's call it since the Trump era started, 60 to 70% approval, and you can see it even in polls that people that are taken by traditionally right-leaning. People want these things. They want a better society, and I don't want to get off into why we have a duopoly rather than 10 or 12 flourishing parties. But it seems to me that hippies were on the nose of most of these things. These are basic human desires, wants, the desire for safety, the desire for an ozone layer that isn't going to collapse, whatever else we might say. And yet, stubbornly, we always hear, oh, America is a center-right country or this. Well, what's in the center now are things that were considered left years ago. Is it something cyclic? Because if, for example, if you look at the 1956 Republican convention, it's way to the left of the Democrats now. It really is a pro-union and stuff. I'm a union person. I'm not in a union currently, but I'm certainly pro-union. Uh, why is a movement that seemingly, at least on the surface, was right on, let's just use 90% of things, so often derided still?
I think we have to think about the hippies and the counterculture within the larger context of the 60s moment. You have a Democratic Party, certainly under Lyndon Johnson, that's trying to expand upon essentially the New Deal and the welfare state at the heart of a capitalist, anti-communist kind of country. So, there's a band called the Great Society, but there also were the Great Society programs that they're named after. And, of course, the name is a little bit in jest. It's kind of, there's a lot of suspicion of government programs, as the U.S., has a strong tradition of kind of anti-statist suspicion of government. So you've got a Democratic Party that seems to, in the mid 60s, be trying to expand government, the role of government in making a better world, but then of course the party gets totally tethered to the escalation of the Vietnam War as part of this kind of anti-communist phenomenon. And the Democratic Party is stuck, of course, between the coalition is this bizarre coalition of progressives, African Americans, and Dixiecrats. The Democratic Party can't stay in power if they lose the kind of vestiges of the racist Southern Democratic Party, and this comes apart in the 70s. Okay, so there's this political stuff going on, right? You have two parties. American politics is always coalitional within the two-party system, and the Democratic coalition falls apart around civil rights, around the war, around these regional questions, and the Republicans are quite good at kind of putting together a new coalition that pulls in the Sun Belt states. And now we have, are there any Rockefeller Republicans left? I don't think there's one.
Yeah, limousine liberals actually were meant to describe John Lindsay, a Republican mayor first elected in New York.
Because I'm in New York State, I always think of Nelson Rockefeller because who created the SUNY system in which I teach. So they're gone. I mean, if anything, they would be kind of in the middle of the Democratic Party now. Yeah. Okay, so that's the political picture in the U.S. Culturally, I think your question also asked kind of, well, what happens to this kind of what do we want to call it? This kind of flowering, so to speak, of the quest for individual authenticity, freedom, liberation, even. How does all this cultural stuff, all this questioning fit? And I think one of the enduring problems coming out of the 60s was no one could quite figure out how to channel those energies into a winning political program, right? So where do culture and politics hook up? Okay, maybe Clinton was sort of trying to do it, right, in the 90s. In a way, Obama's coalition is about this legacies of the 60s, and maybe if Harris wins, that's the kind of new version of this coalition. As you were suggesting, what is it for? It's basically for a kind of Scandinavian form of social democracy in the country, something like that. Where all these forces on what we think of as the progressives or the left or the Democratic Party, since the 60s have been trying, how do you connect those cultural energies of questioning of the search, the spiritual quest, the search for authenticity. How do you organize those into a political movement? How do you channel them into a winning political coalition? And then on the right, of course, the question is, how do you channel some of those energies into a conservative or reactionary vision of the country? And that's why I think that's the yuppies to some extent, that in the 80s, that's neoliberalism in the 90s and 2000s. And I think there are vestiges of it you can see in the Trump movement, that there's kind of some legacies of this yearning for authenticity there. So I don't have an answer to your question other than to say the best I can make of it as a historian is to try to think about the way that those cultural energies we're in a way beyond politics, but of course we have a political system, and there's been this effort to figure out how to route those energies of the hippies and the counterculture into various political formations.
Well, I want to thank you for a very interesting and stimulating discussion. I was just thinking, I'm actually doing a show about what history is with 3 other historians, hopefully in the next month or so. And maybe I could do a follow-up show with you because, and I'm going to certainly look more into your oeuvre. By the way, since we were mentioning limousine liberals and that, and also fun being part of the hippies thing, have you ever read a terrific biography about John Lindsay called Fun City? He coined the term about New York when he was first elected in '65. He said, "Fun City." Really, a pretty good and incisive book I found. I read it a few years ago. But anyway, I'll get. Just want to thank you again, and I will link to michaeljkramer.net, your website, for anyone who wants to check it out. So thank you for spending time speaking with me.
Thank you, Dan.